Welcome to Blessed Man Meditations. My name is Andy. On this YouTube channel, I offer thoughtful responses to skeptical objections to the Christian faith. I likewise edify the saints by equipping them to provide an answer for the hope that lies within them. I hope that you find value in my work. Please like my videos, send me comments, and please subscribe. Let's work together to contend earnestly for the faith that's been once for all delivered to the saints. You have found Blessed Man Meditations, where we provide answers to the actual side of Christianity and equip Christians to provide an answer for the hope that, according to 1 Peter 15, today on Blessed Man Meditations, we conclude our tour through Is Atheism Dead by Eric Metaxas. Metaxas is a best-selling author whose books have been translated into languages. He's the host of a nationally syndicated radio show, conversation series, Socrates in the City. Metaxas is a prominent cultural commentator whose work has appeared in the New York Times, the New Yorker, the Atlantic Journal. The link there you see on this slide is a link to the article that he published in Wall Street Journal. It is also the appendix in this book, is Part 3, Chapter 30. Part of the book is entitled What is Truth? Chapter 30 is entitled Conclusions, the Meaning of Meaning. Sterling Memorial Library at Yale was intentionally designed to look like a European cathedral, but not to the glory of God. It was built with the funds set aside for a spectacular new chapel, but by 1924, the year the library was conceived, mandatory chapel had fallen out of fashion. Yale. The extraordinary and in some ways astonishing library building, which opened in 1931, was meant to lift up the secular idea of knowledge and learning. And to be sure, no expense was spared in its design and construction. Each slide, incidentally, has pictures from this library. The long central corridor, along which one proceeds toward the circulation desk, I'm guessing that's this below, was intended to look like the nave of a cathedral, and it does. From some distance, the circulation desk looks, for all the world, like an altar, which was intentional, and above it is what the architect openly called his altar mural, which portrays a woman who looks very much like Mary, but who is in fact alma mater, a personification of the university. If one makes a right at this juncture, one finds oneself walking along an opened cloistered walk featuring 4 bas-relief sculptures on corbels. These portray students at their desks, but none are studying. One listens to a radio, another ogles at a pinup, and another is asleep next to a mug of beer. That one might be the mug of beer up there. The fourth of these carved images, however, is of a student who's studying, and who ever since he came into being under the carver's chisel in the late 1920s has been earnestly looking at the open pages of a stone book. On the left page are carved the letters U-R-A, and on the right page the letters J-O, and below them the letters K-E. There's a picture of this one. The jappery here, committed to stone, "You are a joke," may be read 2 ways. On the one hand, it is perfectly puerile. Haha, as if it might instead have read, "Ain't you dumb? Hi-ya." But on another level, it's rather dark. It seems to say that if you're really intent on studying, ambitious young fellow, you might take care in how hard you do study, and in how far you wish to proceed in your studies. It seems to say that if you study well enough, you'll discover something unpleasant that your less studious brethren may have missed. You'll discover that there's no meaning to life, or any meaning at all in the universe, so that you yourself and your own life have no meaning, but are rather merely a cosmic joke. Since you who have been studying at least seem to have wished to know, may now know You are the product of a random and meaningless evolutionary process that, oddly enough, has produced a creature who longs for meaning in a world without meaning. Find that at the end of your labors, if you keep searching for meaning, you will at least come to the grim notion that you're studying, and all you do henceforth in your life you do in vain. Discover that you're not the beloved creation of a loving God, but are the random sputtering of a blind, deaf, and dumb cosmos, and that whatever noble ideas your young head holds about knowledge, wisdom, or love are specters, phantasms created by a blind process whose purposeless purpose is the perpetuation of your species. So you yourself are actually nothing. Darwin and Freud and others have made this quite plain. While we'll not advertise this dark theme to those parents whose children may one day attend this august institution, while we will not advertise this dark theme to those parents whose children may one day attend this august institution, we will at least here make a winking nod to it, here where you are standing now. So this half-joking sculpture was subtle enough and hidden away that many would not read so far into it. And yet it seems odd to find something saying what this carving seems to say here inside this magnificent and important building, and carved in stone, too. Carving might have well gone another step, echoing Keats's Ozymandias to read, quote, "Behold, thy end, ye foolish in despair," end quote, but it didn't wish to declare its sentiment too loudly. Such places at Yale or the innumerable other academic institutions that follow in Yale's disappearing footsteps are very rarely explicit about the dark worldview that lies quietly in their secular hearts. And whether anyone is brave enough to declare it, it is nonetheless the default worldview of anyone who does not explicitly reject it. If you do not explicitly reject materialism, or that there is no God, then you, by default, accept it. This is what Metaxas is saying. It is the worldview of the world in which we live. But that worldview really is the worldview of those who have rejected God, whether out of irrational and peevish motives, or from a sincere conviction that science has pushed God out of the equation. And that sure is what the new atheists who are on YouTube and write articles and write books, that's what they sure want you to believe, that they've pushed God out of the equation. It is the mostly unspoken philosophy of the secular culture that grew out of these universities, and that in the 40 years following the creation of that carving crept slowly outward beyond the elite universities and the cultural elites, but through them both into the wider culture itself, until in 1966 it stepped out onto the brightly lit center stage that was the cover of Time magazine, asking, "Is God dead? Now what?" So by 1966, and by default ever since 1966, the cognoscenti determined, without saying it openly, that God was really dead, or actually never had existed. And the end of all our yearning as a species had finally culminated in a very serious conclusion, and ending with a neck-wringing twist, as it were. They had concluded that at the very end of all our searches for meaning throughout the centuries lay an answer we had not anticipated. It is an answer that really is a non-answer. It is a conundrum, a paradox, but not in anything like a happy way. In fact, it seems to be a cosmic joke played on us by an indifferent universe, one that cannot even enjoy our humiliation, which is somehow even more humiliating. The indifferent universe can't enjoy our humiliation. We have no one to reproach, but we feel the humiliation nonetheless, which is of course strange and seems to be part of the unfunny joke. But that is the sum of it. It is a ghastly joke of perfect meaninglessness. What are we to do about it? Well, for one thing, we can reject it with every atom of our being. Have we not seen that there's enough evidence to reject that we mean nothing? We mean nothing? that we are a cosmic joke. That we live in an indifferent universe. Can we not see there's enough evidence to reject such risk conclusions? Because there's much more evidence than merely enough to reject those things. There is enough evidence to lead toward the God who created the universe and who created us. But before we talk about that, let's pretend we haven't found such evidence. Let's think about those before 1966 and the many more after who were unaware of the other side of the story or even the possibility of a happy ending. What did they do in response to the grim news that the God they thought existed did not, and that we were alone in the universe? What was that journey like towards something that ended in nothing? For many of us who drank the cultural Kool-Aid along these lines, the journey toward meaning or God was something like walking hopefully along a trail in the woods. It was growing darker and darker, but we continued hoping at the end of the long trail on which we've been walking since before we could remember to find a homey cottage with some lights on and someone there to welcome us. A friend whom we hadn't known, but who knew and loved us, who'd been expecting us all this time. As the darkness became almost complete, we at last glimpsed in the distance to a glow and carefully made our way toward it. But then at the end of this trail, the flickering light that we had seen and walked toward turned out not to be the light of a welcoming cottage, but rather a frightening jack-o'-lantern set upon a dead stump surrounded by marsh and swamp in every direction. The wicked seeming conundrum frightens us. The orange and yellow grin is dead, the mockery of a smile, just as the head is the mockery of a human head, and just as every corpse is the mockery of a living human being. We are horrified that the final answer to our quest and question is a heart-stopping and blood-chilling non-answer, and so we stand there frozen, unable to proceed further. We found, after our nearly endless searching, that the meaning of life is that life has no meaning, and that our lives have no meaning. But what does that mean? Could the idea that our lives have no meaning itself have meaning? Couldn't we create meaning? What exactly is meaning now that we're on the subject? Why should we be so desperate for it? And what shall we do now, if not crumple to the damp floor and expire, never again to be heard from in the endless eons of never-ending and perfectly dead universe? And what does it matter? This is, I think, Metaxas, is saying this is what materialism gets you. I mean, because obviously if you believe in God and an afterlife, and if Christianity is true, then life does have meaning. Most people faced with this grim conclusion, the fact that life has no meaning, if you're a materialist, really can't face it directly. It's really too much to take in. Only a few have come close to facing this horror directly and honestly. We see that Sartre tried and that Camus did too, but even then, in the end, they were not able to face it. They eventually believed that somehow it was not possible, that it couldn't be. They knew that no matter what they knew, that something else told them that this idea of a world without God or meaning could not be the whole story. It could not be as they thought. Most of us who see that grinning death's head at the end of the trail cannot face it head on either and turn away from long before Sartre and Camus did. Like them, we know this cannot be the whole story, can it? Some in history, thankfully extremely few, like Marc de Sade, have faced this idea of complete meaninglessness head on and extremely perversely have embraced it utterly, even wantonly. Picture of Sade. They decided that anything that might give them any pleasure or excitement was worth doing, including even raping and killing one's own children. Sade monstrously wrote of this and celebrated it with a cynicism so hellish and dark that most sane people recoil in horror. That sounds terrible. But there really have existed a few like him who concluded that if there really is no good or evil in the universe, which if there is no God, there is no ultimate good or evil in the universe because there is no objective standard from which good or evil comes. If there really is no good or evil in the universe, they would live out that reality and even revel in their profoundly sick way. Others, like Adolf Hitler, have determined that what Sade essentially did privately and for his own amusement might be done on a greater scale. Of course, what he did with the Jews. They would not merely write of it and share it with the world in books, but would live it out in an epic way, not merely abusing a few powerless victims, but invading entire nations with tanks and rockets and torturing, murdering, and enslaving millions, seemingly thinking themselves as gods beyond good and evil who could simply do as they pleased. And we looked at that in an earlier chapter in this book where we looked at some of the atheistic atrocities, uh, and that was done earlier. Who will punish us? They thought. We are free and alone in the universe. Many others have not been able to do such terrible things, but nonetheless took in the full horror of the situation and chose simply to end their own lives. Yes, there are many who see that there's no hope, and they choose that way of escaping it by taking their own lives. Most people, of course, cannot do any such thing. Why they cannot is another question. But what do they do instead? They look away from the ghastliness and the grim logic of it all and do the only thing they can. They split the difference between the bang and the whimper. They're not proud of themselves for living in half measures, but they simply don't know what else to do. Most of us are like that if we're honest. So we, or they, must live our lives in a strange tension. They may darkly hint at the meaninglessness of life now and again, but they can neither face it or embrace it fully. They do their best to accept what parts of it they can and work to ignore the contradiction that's left over. Perhaps life has no meaning, but they will neither kill themselves in despair nor seize the dark logic of it and exultantly live out wild Promethean possibilities, becoming drunk with such power as they might wrest from others. Either option is far too much, so they will instead do the easier thing and, as we say, split the difference between the bang of evilly exulting in it and the whimper of exiting the dark situation via suicide. If they've chosen this middle path, they might think, if life is short and does not continue into eternity and there really is no good or evil, I suppose I will do what I like in the meantime. And there are many who live like this, and for some of them, it ends in a destructive path for themselves and others. I will seize the day and more or less live for pleasure and fun and try to get as best I can. I won't pretend to be happy about it, for there's something inside me that doesn't like it very much, though I can't say what. I will not raise my children to be bold atheists, but neither will I raise them to believe in anything. I will raise them to make their own decisions on such big questions, whatever that means, and of course it doesn't mean much since the answers have eluded me, so I will essentially raise them to raise themselves, if that means anything. Who knows? After all, who can know? But perhaps also, as a mild form of revenge upon the God who in the end proved not to be there when they sought him, they will never acknowledge him more than social convention dictates they must. And they will scorn those who stupidly pretend they know he's there when they know he's not, thinking their faith mocks us in our pain and doubts and disgusts us in its blind hope for what we know doesn't exist. Most of the time they will drift along with the crowd that avoids these dullards and cringes at them. If necessary, they'll cut such fools socially as a dowager. This countess cuts the demimonde on the mezzanine because life is too short to pretend or something. But many others have seen enough evidence to know that the meaninglessness of life and absence of God could not be true. Like Sartre and Camus, they at some point, perhaps early in life, perhaps later, came to the conclusion that God must really be the answer and that he was there and that he was worth pursuing and turning toward as they were able to do so. Right. People like Sartre and Camus discover that life does have meaning and God is the ultimate source of that meaning. Of course, the best reason to come to God is not only for purpose and meaning, but it's also for righteousness. Through faith in Christ, it's for forgiveness and eternal life and pardon and justification, freedom from guilt, freedom from sin, power to overcome sin. It's not just a better life, because there are plenty of people who have and do suffer and even suffer a martyr's death for their Christian faith. So it's not just about a better life, it's about forgiveness, it's righteousness. and yet they did not do so. People like Sartre and Camus. So some people like Sartre and Camus came to the conclusion that God must be the answer, that he was there and worth pursuing, but they did not pursue him. Why? Why wouldn't they pursue him? Dylan Thomas knew at least enough to hedge his bets. He sensed there might be something out there, perhaps God, and he simply would not surrender to the hints that we are alone in the universe. But he died before he had the chance to get beyond all that, still hedging his bets. Many people know far more than he did that God really must be the answer and is, and yet they don't turn to him. Why don't some people who know that they should turn to God don't turn to God? Why do some people not turn to God? In many cases, it really is simply the power of the cultural narrative, and the price that must be paid if we go against it. Right? It's hard to not go with the flow, to not go with the crowd. Many who have power in our culture and the various worlds in which we live our lives have made clear that talking about things like the meaning of life or the existence of God too earnestly is embarrassing and socially unacceptable. They've bought into the false cultural narrative or aren't willing to look past it. And if they have anything to say about it, we won't look past it either. So we have to be honest. What others think about us matters. So we have to be honest. What others think matters to most of us. And most of them have bowed to the cultural narrative and will do their part to see that we bow to the cultural narrative too. Cultural narratives and paradigms are powerful. They've always been powerful. 500 years ago, things were dramatically different. Those in power believed in God. If you dared speak against faith in God of the Bible or didn't talk about him as they thought you should talk about him, you might not only lose social status, you might be tortured or burned alive. Historically speaking, those in power are generally able to determine which beliefs are allowed and which are not. So even today, in the so-called free cultures of the West where freedom of speech and religious liberty are enshrined in our laws, we know that it's not that simple, that there are cultural forces at play that still have the power to shut most of us up. Will you let the cultural forces at play that have the power to shut us up, will you let them shut you up? Because as it happens, you have power too. You have the power to speak the truth or to be silent. But if you don't speak the truth when you're able, you yourself become complicit in this false paradigm. Will you participate in silencing the truth? You are quiet about what you know to be true. Are you not perhaps worse than those who genuinely don't know it to be true? So don't you, who know so much more than you need to know about these things, have some responsibility in all of this? Of course you already know that you do. You get to be a part of giving others genuine hope in the genuine God who is the author of life and hope and goodness and truth and beauty. It is what you were created to do, but perhaps until now didn't understand this as you do now. That only means that you can now live as the one who made you live. You can begin now. And this is not merely a poetic or nice idea. It is true. God of the universe wants you to spread goodness and truth and beauty wherever you go to his glory. There are people whose lives you will touch whether you know it or not. So now you know. Have we missed anything? Now let's look at the witness of beauty. Dylan Thomas somehow knew, because he allowed himself sometimes to think with his feelings, which often can go wrong but sometimes go right. The world in which he lived could not be without God. His innate sense of justice and beauty and his love for his father seemed to him to be compelling evidence that despite everything, there must be something more. There are moments in which most of us experience something that speaks to us of something else, that points us beyond ourselves to something greater, and that gives us the idea that despite all the darkness around us, there's goodness and truth and beauty and poetry and even justice in the universe, all of which seem to hint at the others and beyond to God himself. Many things in each of our lives have been hints and clues that there really is a God, that what we think is not merely our own crazy idea, but is in fact the truth. In this book, Is Atheism Dead? By Eric Metaxas, Metaxas has shown that science, in a way never dreamt possible, has on several fronts pointed so vigorously and overwhelmingly to God that to look away from this evidence would be not merely tragic, but would be a kind of betrayal. We cannot look at such things and then shrug as if they are nothing to us. Truth is not so easy to come by. And when we do come upon it, we have a responsibility to it. Truth and goodness and love all require something of us. And the archaeological record, too, is nothing less than extraordinary. No one 100 years ago dreamt that we would have continued to discover things that supported the historicity of the Bible, but we have continued to discover things that support the historicity of the Bible. It's been an astonishing run, and it continues this minute. The illogic of the atheist position on several levels has never been quite as easy to see, or to see through. How can we shrug at such things? But there's another thing that speaks to us of God, and that is beauty. We hardly know what beauty is, but why does it often break our hearts, as if it were a door that opens up to another world? In the summer of 1943, Cephalonia, the Greek island where Metaxas' family has lived since the 15th century, was occupied by German and Italian troops. Metaxas' father was 16 years old. When the war began, he left the island's capital, Argostoli, for the safety of his family's village, Navrata, 16 miles east, but now and again he would return. That summer, he found himself in Argostoli for a few days, and each evening would go with his friends to the main square to eat and drink and socialize. One of those nights, after midnight, they suddenly heard the music of a trumpet from a distant rooftop. They sat, transfixed, and listened as its sonorous melody swam sinuously through the black night above their heads until every soul there who heard it was stunned into silence and pierced by its beauty. They later learned that the trumpet player was a German soldier standing on a roof overlooking the square. The song he played that evening was Enrico Toselli's Morning Serenade, and its haunting beauty struck everyone so powerfully amidst the atmosphere of the occupation and war that Metaxas' father never forgot it, always saying that it was the single most beautiful thing he ever experienced. But what could it be about those notes embroidering the air that somehow wordlessly, spoke to everyone about the meaninglessness and pain of war, and that pointed everyone who heard them beyond the ramparts of their present difficulties towards something so beautiful and glorious and true that many of them wept as they sat and listened? How could mere sounds do that to someone? What was it exactly that had the ability to point everyone listening towards something ineffable and overwhelmingly and heartbreaking? Something similar occurs at the end of the 1991 Lawrence Kasdan movie Grand Canyon. It happens after the ensemble of characters have managed to make their way through the litany of unpleasant and sometimes threatening circumstances in the grittier parts of crime-ridden Los Angeles during the course of a long night. At the end of these difficulties, they all somehow find themselves together the next day, standing at the lip of the Grand Canyon, raptly taking in the overwhelming grandeur of that greatest of geographical fissures, struck dumb with awe. Somehow this sublime beauty of what they're looking at seems to be the answer, or a door to the answer that they have all been longing for during the difficult course of the story. But what can it be about that mere absence of rock, about that hole a mile deep, 18 miles across, that could cause those characters and the movie audience staring along with them to be so utterly arrested and smitten? Why does the grandeur and beauty and sheer vastness of what they're looking at point beyond itself? And to what does it point? Something similar to these things once happened to Metaxas. Half a century after Metaxas' father listened to that trumpet that night in Cephalonia, Metaxas was in Cephalonia himself. Metaxas was in Marvada, the village where Metaxas' family has lived for so many centuries. It was late August, and at the end of the day Metaxas took a walk and eventually found himself on a very high cliff overlooking the sea. Perhaps what happened had something to do with the fact that he was young, and perhaps it had something to do with the fact that Metaxas knew his father had been young there and had seen the very things Metaxas was looking at all those years before. But what particularly struck Metaxas that day as he stood there on that cliff overlooking the Ionian Sea was something Metaxas could not recall seeing before. It was the sun and moon strangely close to each other in the sky in front of him, floating like perfect orbs just beyond his reach. One was to Metaxas' left, roughly at eye level, and the other was to Metaxas' right, at the same level. The air was deadly quiet. Now and again Metaxas heard the birds singing. It was very still and pleasantly warm. In those few moments looking at these two heavenly bodies, at these two heavenly spheres hanging there, as if for Metaxas alone, were as transcendent as any Metaxas has ever experienced. The colors of the sea below and before Metaxas, and the fairy tale beauty of the sun and moon in such magical proximity to each other, simply undid Metaxas. It was more beautiful than almost anything Metaxas can remember, a moment that pointed beyond itself to eternity. But what is beauty? Why does it seem to have a moral quality and to point to something beyond itself? Is that real? Or is it just something Metaxas imagines? Why does there seem to be a poetry and beauty in the sun and moon and stars? And why did God make the silver moon and the golden sun appear precisely the same size to us? Did he have beauty and symmetry in mind when he did that? Or did that just happen? Why does it feel like it means something? Why does beauty like that break our hearts and make us want to weep, as though God himself wrapped his arms around us and told us he loved us and wanted us to live with him in paradise forever and ever? Why does extraordinary goodness break our hearts? And why do innocence and vulnerability sometimes break our heart? Why do these things, what do all these things say to us about the nature of the universe and about who we are in the universe? Everything means everything. Does not the idea that we long for meaning tell us something or everything about who we are and how we are made and by whom? Does not our deep longing for meaning in our own lives and for the meaning of life itself not tell us that we were created for meaning and that without it we can hardly live? In his incomparably beautiful book, Chance or the Dance, author Thomas Howard talks about these things. The book is written in some of the most gorgeous prose Metaxas has ever read, and in a series of short essays it provides a critique of what Howard calls modern secularism by contrasting it with the medieval Christian view. He's really only contrasting atheism and a simple biblical view, but Howard reckons that the Christendom of medieval Western Europe was the fullest cultural expression of the latter. Let's see. The Christendom of medieval Western Europe is the fullest cultural expression of the medieval Christian. Okay. Metaxas is inclined to agree with Howard, and with C.S. Lewis too, whom Howard met and from whom he got many of his ideas, just as Metaxas knew and loved Howard and got many of his own ideas from Howard. In his book, Chance or the Dance, Howard asks some of the questions Metaxas has asked here. But Howard's central question is whether the modern secular view, which is atheistic, materialistic, and reductionist, is correct, or whether the biblical view is correct. Can it be that there's only matter and nothing more than matter? Can it be that the music of that midnight trumpet in the midst of war was merely sound waves pointing to nothing, but which those who heard them imagined were pointing to something? Can it be that the Grand Canyon's just a big hole, and that our reaction to it is the reaction we've been programmed to have through eons of evolution, but which really means nothing except that some chemicals have been released in us for reasons we don't know yet, and that make us feel a certain way for reasons we also don't know yet? In Chance or Dance, Tom Howard says no. So, when we have emotional reactions to things like that, when we are captivated by beauty, it points to the fact that God put in us this capacity to appreciate beauty so that we would look to him. We would look at the creation that he left us in, that he has made us stewards over, and that we would see that the heavens declare the glory of God, that we would see how the fact that creation necessitates there's a creator, and that makes us without excuse, like Romans 1 talks about. It's majestic stuff. Howard says that everything actually means more than what it is, and he says that everything in creation somehow points beyond itself and ultimately points all the way back to God. To be a bit more specific, Howard shows how each single thing in creation is more than what it is and points outward. For example, Howard says when one looks at a borzoi, one inescapably sees something regal and princely about the animal. It's not just a dog in a different shape than other dogs. It has a quality that really evokes regality and princeliness and is meant to evoke those things. It is not only in our minds. God has put those qualities in it. In making it, God is saying something more. According to Howard, God's given us innumerable pictures of other things throughout his creation. When one sees a hyena or buzzard, one is typically repulsed. Somehow these creatures speak to us of death, but in their scavenging behavior and in their outward, in their scavenging behavior and their outward appearances, hyenas and buzzards speak to us of death. Hyenas skulk, but the borzoi prances and struts. It cannot help doing so. Howard says that our general response to all these things is not random, but actually points to other things and other qualities, that these animals to some extent are living pictures of those other qualities. So a lion is thought of as the king of the jungle because he really does bear a stamp of kingship, and a lamb is thought of as gentle and innocent because God is speaking to us about gentleness and innocence through the lamb which he has created. Does the lion's mane suggest a crown? Was that God's idea in creating the lion, or did we borrow the idea of crowns from lions? Or both? Howard says that these creatures did not accidentally evolve into things that suggest this and that suggest this and that, but were created by God specifically to suggest this and that. If a secularist believes that nothing points to itself, if a secularist believes that nothing points beyond itself, nor means anything, we could say they believe that nothing means anything. But how might one sum up the Christian view? What is the opposite of nothing means anything? Would it be everything means something? Perhaps. And if everything means something, then it follows that nothing means nothing. So let's settle on the first of these, since it implies the second. Everything means something. But Tom Howard, in his genius, says that even that is not quite enough. He says that the polar opposite of the dreary secular view, nothing means anything, would really need to be everything means everything. Or better yet, to capture the inescapably exultant reality of the idea, everything means everything with an exclamation point. In other words, the opposite of a godless and dead universe, where meaning does not exist, is a universe so entirely suffused with meaning that not only does everything mean something, but everything means everything. Everything in creation somehow points to everything else in creation. Somehow, in God's impossible economy, everything is connected, somehow, through him. And because the good and beauty and truth in each thing points to him, it reflects off him and points back to every other good thing and beautiful and true thing that exists. It is a dizzying concept, and it is so magnificent that even those of us who believe life has meaning don't often think about how much meaning it has because it can be too much to take in. It can be unbearably beautiful and heartbreaking. It undoes us, but it is meant to undo us too. Because God, who has made us in his image, has created all of creation to point us to himself in every conceivable way. We are not incidental to what he has done. We are central to it, which makes us see that his love for us is so impossibly and unimaginably great that it really is infinitely too much for us to bear. If he did not shield us from it in some way, it would really truly undo us, destroy us. Imagine a goodness so good and a beauty so beautiful and a truth so true and a light so white and so impossibly and blindingly bright that apart from God's infinite love and mercy sheltering us from it, we could not bear it even for a moment. And then imagine a God who shows us his infinite love and mercy precisely so we can bear it, and not just for a moment, but for all eternity. Here comes the grand finale. Is God dead? 2,000 years ago, in Jerusalem, others asked this question: is God dead? Back then, and again more recently in our own time, the facts seem to say that God was dead, that he must be dead. There could be little question of it. Most people in Jerusalem back then felt obliged to acknowledge that God was dead. And many people feel obliged to acknowledge that God is dead today. In Jerusalem, 2,000 years ago, some concluded it very reluctantly and sadly, while others declared it triumphant. The same is true today. In each case, the facts rather strongly suggested that God was dead. But as it happens, God, back then and again now, has revealed things to us that we couldn't have imagined. And based on these new things and again now, we can say something deeply and heartbreakingly beautiful and true. God is not dead. He is alive. Rejoice. That, the end of Is Atheism Dead? By Eric Metaxas. Gone through 30 chapters. So, there is an appendix in this book that is the New York Times op-ed article that has been referenced at the beginning of each video in this series. Here, let's see if we can go to that link right quick. This is the Wall Street Journal article, Science Makes the Case for God, published in 2014. And if we look at this, here it is, 2014. Yeah, I guess you've got to have a subscription to the Wall Street Journal to read the article. So for those who are watching this who have the subscription, you could read the article for free. So that is the end of Is Atheism Dead? By Eric Metaxas. So thank you for watching. Please like, comment, and subscribe. Not sure what we will do next after this. I've got lots of things in the works. So just keep checking back on the channel for other good resources for pointing to the truth of Christianity. Hope you have a blessed rest of your day.